So I'll just introduce Elle now, and then we can get started. So Elle Chenier is a professor in the history department at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. Elle is, I'm sure, well known to you all as a historian of sexuality and gender in 20th century Canada and the United States. Their research has focused particularly on butch and femme lesbian bar culture in post-World War II Toronto, and a moral panics around sexual assault and immigration in 1950s Canada. And they are the author of a 2008 monograph, Strangers in Our Midst, Sexual Deviancy in Post-War Ontario, which explores the popularization of sexual deviancy as a way of understanding and treating sex offenders in Canada. And also of many groundbreaking articles on LGBTQ+ subcultures, on oral history, elite femininity, amongst many other topics. While these are too numerous to list now, I will just mention my current personal favourite, Elle's 2018 article published in the Journal of the History of Sexuality, Love Politics, Lesbian Wedding Practices in Canada and the United States from the 1920s to the 1970s. Absolutely fantastic article, which I urge everyone to read if they haven't already. In addition to this impressive body of individual research, Elle has been active for many years in preserving and promoting public and scholarly engagement with Canadian lesbian history, and is the director and founder of the Archives of Lesbian Oral Testimony, which will form the focus of Elle's talk this evening. We were just discussing earlier, it's one of the few silver linings of the COVID pandemic that we've been able to invite Elle to join us from Canada for our seminar this evening. And I know I'm expressing the feelings of many in saying how excited I am to hear this talk. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Elle Chenier, who will be talking on An Army of Lovers, the exhibit, History as a Tool for Intergenerational Connection and Liberation. Thanks, Elle.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I would just like to begin by saying that I'm coming to you from Tiohtià:ke, which is, you may know as Montreal, Quebec. And I'm really happy to be here with you. So I'm going to be looking down, reading my paper as we academics do. But if anything goes wrong, Rebecca, just come on so I can hear you audibly and say, whatever, if something's gone wrong. So that said, I want to jump right into and I want to read you Rita Mae Brown's poem, 1971 poem, Sappho's Reply. And just remind you, Rebecca, to drop into the chat the links. So I'm going to be talking about an exhibit I did. And whereas most of you are probably professors who tell your students not to go elsewhere but pay attention, I'm going to invite you to do the opposite. And while I'm talking, go and look at the exhibit so you can see what it is that I'm talking about. So she's going to share that. There you go. There's the links now. All right. My voice rings down through thousands of years to coil around your body and give you strength. You who have wept in direct sunlight, who have hungered in invisible chains, tremble to the cadence of my legacy. An army of lovers shall not fail. And that is, of course, where we got the title for the exhibit from, and many, I'm sure everybody here will have heard that line, an army of lovers shall not fail. Okay. Why don't I know this? Exclaimed my students. In fall of 2019, I taught an oral history course to a small, mostly heterosexual group of undergraduates. Our theme was lesbian experience in the women's movement in the 1970s and 80s. Earlier that year, there had been many high-profile, well-funded celebrations of the 50th anniversary of the partial decriminalization of same-sex sex in Canada, including, perhaps most spectacularly, the Royal Canadian Mint's release of a special coin designed by gay male artist Joe Average. Although the 1969 Criminal Code Amendment primarily benefited middle-class white gay men, in 2019, it was celebrated as a victory for all LGBTQ+ people. Once again, middle-class white gay men were a stand-in for the queer experience. I set to use my oral history seminar to provide a feminist corrective to Canada's colonial, patriarchal, white supremacist public memory. Students began by learning that lesbians gave most of their energy to the women's, not gay liberation movement. But the women's movement had its challenges. Enraged and discouraged by rampant sexism in the gay liberation movement, lesbians confronted entrenched homophobia in the women's movement. Yet it was there they stayed. Why? What was it like? And how did they ultimately achieve not only acceptance, but convince the heterosexual feminist majority that lesbianism was a feminist issue? My students' job was to use oral history to answer these questions. But that's not what happened. Virtually everything was new to these students. They didn't know anything about the women's movement, never mind lesbian experience. They were awestruck by their narrator's accomplishments. They were blown away by the diversity of political and social organizations that thrived in the 70s and 80s. They proclaimed that everyone should know their history and raged that it had been hidden from them for all these years. But it's not hidden. Of all historical eras, this one is by far the most documented, at least in North America. We have tens of thousands of miles of archival records on lesbian organizing and experience to scour, and hours of oral histories available for our listening pleasure. Our library's bookshelves buckle under the weight of lesbian novels, books of poetry, and social science studies produced by lesbians in this period. And right beside them are hundreds of books and articles providing deep sociological and historical analyses of this rich primary source material. It is not enough to document the past or even analyze it. Like coming out, remembering is not something we do once. It is something we must do over and over and over again until it becomes part of our public consciousness. The course and the exhibit we produced, called An Army of Lovers, Lesbian, Bisexual, Two-Spirit, and Queer Women in the 1970s and 80s, provided us an opportunity to re-remember the rich history of lesbian feminist activism in Vancouver, British Columbia, and beyond. Now, I want to pause here and express my deep gratitude to Rebecca Jennings and the Institute of Historical Research for providing me with this opportunity to reflect on the relationship between public history and queer scholarly history. And I also want to express my appreciation for scholars based in the UK who are doing this work. And here I'm thinking particularly of Laura Doan, whose work on Alan Turing troubles public history in a good way, and whose book Disturbing Practices also reveals how queer critical historians are perhaps not as free from the taint of nostalgia and the heroic narrative qualities scholars eschew in public history as they might think they are. And I also want to point to Alison Auram's 2012 article, Going on an Outing, the Historic House in Queer Public History, in Public and Popular History. In the course, I had students read Doan's article on Alan Turing and on Auram's article on historic houses, and then they had to write a short narrative that had the two authors meeting at a coffee shop discussing queer public history. And they got bonus points for choosing a coffee that matched the scholarly persona of the two authors. And I have to tell you, with incredible consistency, Laura Doan always had an espresso, maybe a double espresso, and Auram always had something frothy, like a latte or a pumpkin spice, you know. It was very funny. Anyways, I encourage all of you to steal this idea for a student assignment, because it sure makes grading those papers a lot of fun. In my work as a scholar, I find myself returning more and more to the kind of life support and community building that the practice of history provided me with as a young student, and less preoccupied with the latest theoretical advances. And if you don't know my work, it might be helpful to say that I once aspired to be the next Judith Butler. But perhaps I have become more and more interested in the heart and less in the head, more Spinoza and less Descartes, you could say. I find myself returning to what first drew me to the field, the practice of getting to know myself and others through life history, the simple joy of discovery and connection that oral history methodologies offer. If a scholarly term is helpful, you could say I have taken an affective term, but in my experience, theorizing frameworks always fall short of my aim to capture and live in the full complexity of being human. I have become one of those loathsome people, or at least people I used to loathe, who would say, I don't really identify as anything. I'm now that person. Okay, so oral history has never pretended to be about anything other than the quality, texture, shape, and even beauty of human life. But queer theory, particularly as it is written by white scholars, has a little more difficulty with beauty, and I would say a low tolerance for the messy. In the realm of public history, these tensions are very real. I say all of this to you now, not because I'm going to come to some deep theoretical insight at the end that ties my presentation up with a nice bow, but rather to say that I am very alive to these considerations and to let you know that I'm just not concerned with them. When I got turned on to history, it was because it was a tool to help me make sense of my life as a queer survivor of sexual violence. It empowered me to live my life on my own terms, or at least as close to those terms as I am able. And my interest now is to provide this same bridge to better living to my students who, just like us, are struggling to figure out who they are and to navigate a complex and often oppressive and toxic world. My goal is to bring them and myself closer to joy. So back to the story of the course in the exhibit. Because courses at my university have to have broad, general, let me say meaningless titles, and because students almost never look up the detailed course description in the department website, it is the rare individual who knows that my course is topic on queer history. Consequently, my courses do not attract a particularly high number of queer students. Of the 13 who enrolled in the 2019 course I'm talking about, 2 identified as queer, 1 as bisexual. The remainder did not declare a sexual orientation. 7 were cisgender women, 1 identified as a trans woman, 1 identified as transmasculine, and 4 were cisgender men. None knew the theme was lesbian history. Students were tasked with conducting 2 full interviews with a single narrator. So they got 1 narrator, they had to do 2 interviews, and they had to do research on them in between, like on the things they had been involved in. So the second interview could probe more deeply. And those interviews ranged from 1 to 2 hours. And then they had to, their final assignment was to edit those 2 interviews down into a 20-minute audio documentary. Through the course, they received instruction in the history of the women's movement, oral history theory and methods, and audio documentary production. When at the end of the 13-week course, the documentaries were submitted, I was struck by their quality. And you can listen to the longer cuts, which I'll share the link afterwards. I didn't give that to Rebecca, so she hasn't put it up, but you can listen to the full 20-minute ones if you want. They're just in a separate space. Each one was a rich, powerful, and deeply moving account of life as a lesbian and a feminist in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In the end, there was very little attention paid to homophobia in the women's movement, something I had hoped they would document. But that, I don't think that mattered. What they did document was what mattered to them. And what was perhaps most important anyhow, the experience of being part of a vibrant and expansive movement for social change, much, much bigger than oneself. The previous spring, okay, so now I'm going to tell a little bit of a backstory here. The previous spring, I had visited an exhibit marking the 50th anniversary of the partial decriminalization of same-sex sex, which I mentioned at the beginning, right? So it's 1969 was when that happened. So it's 2019, and there had been this exhibit called 69 Positions. Now, this was, before Stonewall, before the gay liberation movement, quote unquote, formally, gets launched. So it would not be out of place to say that in this case, the state was a major progressive actor in social and political change in terms of queer life, gay rights, and so on. However, this exhibit, which was called, so this exhibit that had nothing to do with me, the one I saw in the spring, was called 69 Positions. And it was marking the 50th anniversary. But the exhibit reflected the critical queer left's rejection of a top-down model of social change and focused instead on grassroots organizing and activism in the 70s and 80s. Although the physical space was small, the exhibit artfully displayed primary source documents that captured the energy, passion, and excitement, as well as the struggles of the gay liberation movement. I, however, found it extremely boring. These are just primary sources pinned to the wall, I thought to myself. If you want primary sources, come to my office. I have thousands of them. The exhibit blurb read, in the context of resounding present-day calls to decriminalize drug use, immigration status, sex work, and indigenous resistance, what does this half-century of so-called decriminalization of homosexuality mean for our communities? But nowhere was an answer to be found. I wanted to grab a can of spray paint and graffiti on the wall. So what? Question mark. And so two important things happened after that. I posted my disappointed response on Facebook, as we do. I rarely post negative things on Facebook, but it was more like a sort of, as a historian, and I've talked about, but what happened is several people in my network, including people who ended up being in the exhibit I produced, said that they actually were very moved by it. So that was the first thing that made me rethink my response, that they found it themselves very moving to see their lives represented. So I learned something in that moment, right? I learned that they feel invisible. They don't see their own lives. And I know how powerful it is to see your own life. So as a historian, I'm always looking for like the big narrative analysis, and that was what wasn't there. And then the other thing that happened was somebody, much to my horror, forwarded my post to the exhibit organizer. And she actually reached out to me because she was upset because she looked up to me and I didn't know her personally. And she explained to me that she didn't want to impose a narrative on it. She wanted people to come to their own conclusions. And then of course I realized it was brilliant and what a jerk I was. I felt really bad. But in the end, she ended up auditing my course and we became great friends. And she has everything to do with why I ended up doing the exhibit I did. So it was a story that had this kind of not so great beginning, but it had a really, really beautiful ending. So that's an important piece of it. I don't know that I would have taken on a public history exhibit if those things hadn't happened. Me realizing how valuable seeing themselves, even if it was just primary documents on a wall, was to people who had been active in the 70s and 80s. So that was really important, an important lesson for me. Okay, so when at the end of the course I taught, I had in my hands a small but very rich set of oral documentaries about a community that for more than 2 decades had been asking me to document their experiences, then the next step was obvious that I should create a public exhibit. And of course, I also wanted to speak back to the male dominance of the narrative of the 69, gay liberation narrative too. I wanted to insert women into that narrative. Okay, so student enthusiasm for the material was unlike anything I had ever seen, especially for the queer students in the class. So Holly French said, as a young queer, I have often felt isolated by the lack of older queer role models in my life. No one in my grandparents' generation that I know in my family is queer, and I have unfortunately discovered that many are homophobic. I was lucky enough to find online communities, but until I met my interviewee, this is my favorite line, I never thought I'd be able to find someone older than like 40 to look up to and realize queer people have futures too. Kirsty Goodfellow said, I left both of my interviews with my mind buzzing with excitement and hope. This process has meant more to me than words can accurately express. I am so grateful I got to be a part of this. I cannot stress enough the importance of interviewing people who are directly involved in the situations we read about in academic articles. But the same was true also for heterosexual students. So Sierra, a Métis woman who is interested in sport and policing, made a very strong connection with her interviewee, Esther Shannon, who had a background like Sierra in athletics, but was an activist for sex worker rights. And so Sierra's interest in policing lined up with that. And so Sierra said, my interviews with Esther taught me how powerful a collective is. Esther discussed in her interview how the very soul of feminism is organizing. Women gathering with a common goal and discussing some sort of oppression or issue. Esther volunteered all her life to make a difference for women all over the country, and she has inspired me to do the same. I am forever grateful to be part of such an inspiring project and can now hopefully educate and inspire others. I have new skills and connections I will carry with me for the rest of my life. For Serena Zhao, a shy student from China, who explained to us that lesbianism is simply not discussed in China, or at least not anywhere she had ever been. She described her interview with her mixed race Chinese white narrator as, quote, she described her narrator as, quote, uncompromising in her independence and her desire for her own life, even in the face of threats of institutionalization from her own father. She lives her life on her own terms, and that's admirable. And she said that interviewing Mary Wu Sims has helped me become more confident socially and professionally. So reading all this, you can imagine, I felt that I was seeing the kind of fire I had always longed to ignite in my students. And I was thrilled that straight students seemed to be just as excited as the queer ones. So to say that I was looking forward to leading them through the creation and execution of a public history project was an understatement. Okay, I'm just going to maybe skip through this. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit. I just wanted to reflect very briefly on, one of the concerns we have in oral history and public history is these kind of creating positive, uncritical representations about the people. And this is something that many scholars touch on in their writing about this. And of course, I'm very, very aware of this. But of course, the interesting thing about interviewing and working with lesbian feminists of the 70s and 80s is that not only are they themselves very self-reflective and critical, but it is the critical theory they wrote that is the theory that informed who I became. So it's a little bit like the multiple mirror situation that we're looking at here. So there really, I guess the point is there's no danger. I suppose there's always a danger of writing an uncritical history, but not with this group of people. They're not uncritical of their movement and themselves, and they're deeply self-reflective. And also, I just want to reinforce the point that Laura Doan makes that even the most scholarly of queer historians can lean toward origin stories and heroic narratives. And that even the most scholarly amongst us long to see ourselves be seen by others and to have a sense of belonging. And so history, therefore, cuts both ways. It can write us in and it can write us out. And I think we all know that. So as a social group, lesbian feminists tend to be deeply self-aware, reflective, and critical. In fact, as I say, they wrote the critical theory that many of us use. They most definitely did not want to be heroes of anyone's narrative. So at a planning meeting I organized where we hammered out the look, feel, and overall message of the exhibit with the interviewees said that the exhibit's primary purpose should be to empower young people. The women's movement taught women that they could create what they wanted and needed themselves, explained writer and educator Cynthia Cole. Quote, I want to convey to young people what's going to happen in the future. It's in your hands. Nora Randall, who was active in publishing and theater, added, we didn't know what we were doing. We just did it. Like many oral historians, for them, history is not about honoring or simply remembering. It is to empower. For the students, these women were nothing less than heroic, but they refused to be represented that way. Okay, so overall, the exhibit was a huge success. Two students, both who I quoted before, Christy and Holly, made a presentation at SFU in a competition it was called the SFU Student Community Engagement Competition, and they won the grand prize, which was $3,000. It was also shortlisted for a Governor General's History Award for Excellence in Community Programming. That said, though, it wasn't without its difficulties and challenges. And I'll mention the two that occurred. First, community projects of this nature come with certain risks. In this case, a failure to follow procedures resulted in the exhibit research assistant losing the personal photo album and a book of one of the project participants. Provided with a scanner so that she would not have to remove personal materials from people's homes, precisely for this reason, she nevertheless did on one occasion. And as a result, as a result of a series of very unfortunate events, this person's materials were disposed of accidentally. I'm currently working with my institution to provide the narrator with financial compensation, but no amount of money can make up for the loss to the individual, nor will it repair the damage done to our personal and professional relationship. But equally heartbreaking was the enthusiasm I witnessed in the classroom dissipated as soon as the course ended. Only one of the students took part in the creation of the exhibit. And let me just reinforce that the exhibit was based on work the students had done. And it was the one who had been hired as a research assistant. So there might be several reasons for this. The only way to get course credit for participation was to undertake a directed reading with me in which we would deepen our understanding of queer and public history. One student did take that up, but they pursued a project of their own and they didn't continue to work on this project. SFU students are typically juggling family and paid work responsibilities while trying to finish a degree. And on top of that, students in this seminar were in the final stages of degree completion. So they tend to be very focused on ticking the last boxes to get to graduation. And finally, although I have no evidence to support it, I suspect that to become involved in an uncredited extracurricular activity would only be of interest to those who had personally benefited from it, either because they are queer or have an interest in public history. So the work of remembering, it seems, was once again fading fast. But of course, we don't get out of here without mentioning COVID. So the course ended in December of 2019, and I set as a goal an opening for March 8th, 2020, International Women's Day, which also was the 50th anniversary of the release of the final report of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. So I wanted to sort of push back on the gay lib with some feminism. So the exhibit opened as planned March 8th in the Vancouver City Archives, which had recently acquired a massive collection of local gay and lesbian materials and was thrilled to host it in their foyer. But the week before, the novel coronavirus started showing up in Canada with increasing frequency. And knowing most of the people attending the exhibit would be over the age of 50, I decided to cancel the opening. The city would not begin canceling public events for another week. But knowing that a lot of people wouldn't hear about the cancellation, we went ahead and set up anyways. And sure enough, quite a few people came, about 20 people ended up coming. Although still heartbroken that students had not played any role in the creation of the exhibit except the one who was hired as an RA, I was really proud to have finally done something for the local community that had been asking me to document their history for so long, but which I had been too busy with more important work to do. During the few hours the exhibit was open at the Vancouver City Archives, one of the interviews said to me while looking at the banners, "I felt I'd been forgotten." For those brief moments, at least, her and the many others, and the others' many years as activists, determined to make a better future for all, including queer people, were out of the archives and in plain view. The challenge now is how to keep it there. Thank you.